Good evening, everyone. We want to welcome you all to the next edition of our guest speaker series here at the Holland Land Office Museum, which is made possible in part through a DEC GREE grant program from Go Arts. We want to thank them for supporting this program, which allows us to bring in wonderful guest speakers and concerts throughout the year. So we're very delighted to have John Zach with us tonight, who will be presenting on his newest book, Built to Burn, about the Clevelandville School Fire of 1954. John is a local legend, as many have told me tonight, so...
I don't know you yet.
Well, you will. So, was in broadcasting in and around Buffalo for 56 years. This is actually his third book that he's written. The first was called Train Man, and the second, which is also up on the table, Dave Buffalo's River Burned. And he's even been named Buffalo Citizen of the Year twice. So he's got a lot of accolades to his name, but we're very happy to have him tonight. So without further ado, take it away.
Everybody can hear me okay now? Everybody in the back can hear me?
Yes. I'm fine.
You too, right? I don't want to bore anybody, but in case anybody does get bored, I brought a 6-pack of beer with me. This is a 6-pack of beer. I brought it for a reason, and I'll tell you more about that a little later. You know, I'm looking at the way everybody is dressed here, you know, nice and casual, you know, because I'm leaving the house today, and my wife goes, "You're going like that?" Did they do that to you? Yeah.
It's been over there.
I said, nobody dresses up. I mean, you should see the way Tom Botterly used to come to work. You know? Well, anyway, thank you for coming. I decided to write this book, Built to Burn, and I'll tell you more about the title, because all I kept seeing were references that someone should write a book about the fire. As I'm reading old newspapers and blogs and emails that people have been sending. But I can't tell you the amount of work and research that went into it. But even though I'm telling you that, I'm also telling you that anybody in this room could have written this book. Anybody here could have written this book. Because virtually everything that's in my book has already been reported by the Buffalo Evening News, the Buffalo Courier Express, and the Cheektowaga Times. So my job was to get all that information, soak it in, and compile it into book form, so you wouldn't have to do what I did, and that's go through hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands, of newspaper articles that were in the paper especially between 1954 and 1957. The annex that burned and took the lives of 15 children and injured 16 others, plus 3 adults, was made out of wood. And that's a picture of the fire that was taken shortly after it started. It's on the cover of the book. Here it is again. Same picture. These buildings were all the same. There were annexes. I don't know if any of you guys ever went to school in Buffalo, but chances are, even here in the Genesee County area, there were buildings just like that attached to some other government building, mostly schools. They originally were not intended to be classrooms, but they were intended as low-income housing for people who came to work in the defense industry, plants like Curtiss-Wright, General Electric, Bell Aircraft, back during World War II. They were meant to house all these families who came to work here. But then, when the war was over, and GIs came home, got married, began to have families, all of these schools like Cleveland Hill and probably schools here in Batavia were overwhelmed by a student population that they were not prepared to accommodate. And so goes the story about the Cleveland Hill Annex. There were buildings that looked identical to that all over, including here in Batavia, including counties across New York State and across some parts of the country also. They were all the same. There were two of these buildings in Cheektowaga. This one that burned, and there was one about a mile away in the low-income area called Tyrunda. That's where all the defense people lived in their low-income housing. That school was twice as big as the annex that burned. Now, why did it burn? Well, here we are 70 years later, and there's really no true consensus, because you're going to run into people who go, I know what caused that fire. It was this, it was that. And they have their own personal opinions as to what caused the fire. But in my research, it didn't take me long to figure out what caused the fire, because it was in black and white right in the newspapers. But I'll give you something, let me read a couple of lines here. I wrote a chapter here. How could this have happened? I mean, this was a school. In the 1950s, there was no safer place to be except in a school. Times have changed, haven't they? Now, there were headlines in the paper almost every day, in all of the local newspapers. Now, these are some headlines that I've quoted. Not a boiler blast, the chief says. The furnace is in good shape. The fire started in the scenery room. The fire started on the first floor, not in the basement. Fumes from paint suggested as the cause of the fire. And it goes on and on and on. There's a whole page of local headlines taken out of the newspapers. It was just a guessing game that just went on and on and on. There was a coal-fired furnace in the basement of this annex. And it had been the subject of complaints for months on end. You know, children were saying, why is it so hot in here? Why is it so cold in here? I gotta put my sweater on. There were smoke-filled hallways. There were hazy mists all over the school. Not in the main building, but in the annex, where these children were learning music and art. But now, why wasn't something done about these complaints? Teachers complained. Some people wanted to know if anybody was smoking in the annex when this fire broke out. Nobody really knows. You know why? Because after 70 years, just think of it. Stories just change. You know, opinions change. Records that were needed to be preserved were either misplaced, put in the wrong drawer, or they just disappeared altogether. Which is why I just started compiling all this myself. And it was very easy once I got started. I logged onto a website called newspapers.com. It was a very affordable website. And that's where I got almost all of my information, with the exception of some things that were never publicized that were given to me after I filed Freedom of Information Law requests. Now, consensus is that this fire started at 11:22 in the morning. That's generally accepted. All the newspapers had that time. Now, here's one of the first pictures taken of the fire. Does anybody notice anything about the picture that just seems a little bit unusual? But just take a look at the people around there. And look at the head start that fire had. Look at it.
No fireman.
Exactly. No fireman. There's not one firefighter there. That's a head start that fire had. Remember all these stories you heard when you were growing up about, authors and publishing and being a book? If you write a book, a publisher won't even look at the book unless he looks at how creative you are when you write. They look for that one lead line that's going to grab you and hold you throughout the book, And sometimes I think of this. I shouldn't, but I think of it, And my editor always told me, don't worry about it. Just do what comes naturally. But when you delve into a story like this, when I go to bed at night, like at 2 o'clock in the morning, I'll wake up and I'll be looking at the ceiling, and I'm saying, oh, Jesus, how can I describe that? Then this one thing came to me, My lead line into my first chapter was, how dare the sun rise again the morning after the fire, And it gave me goosebumps just thinking about it. And so that's how I led into the book. But here we go. All these guys here are looking at the fire, no one's there. A short time later, and there are more pictures in my book, there's 3 or 4 firemen, and they were basically at 3 lines pouring water into this raging inferno. Now, this is the east end of the building. The west end, where the children died, was on that side, way on the south end, where all that black smoke is rising. And these kids didn't have a chance. Yes, sir?
Question. That upper right photo, the
This one?
fire, yes, the fire started at 11:22 a.m.
Yes, sir.
When was that photo taken?
That's a good question. That's a good question. And I'll tell you more about the man who took these pictures. The man's name was Nelson Frank. He was a local amateur photographer who just loved photography, and he just happened to be passing by in the Cleveland Hill area when he heard the sirens and he saw the smoke. There are many other pictures available that this man took, and he took some right from the corner of Harlem Road and Cleveland Drive. All you could see was smoke rising, and but exactly what time, I really can't say because I don't know. But he just happened to be passing by. Now, after the fire, I'll have to get ahead of myself now just to answer your question. As you know, when things like this happen, the district attorney gets involved, and a grand jury is impaneled every month, and they investigate local fires, criminal activity, and all sorts of things. So there was no question that this fire was going to be investigated by the grand jury. One of the first things that the grand jury did was put out a notice through the district attorney appealing to anybody in the area who may have happened to be passing by with a camera to please come forward, because that way we may be able to determine the exact time the fire started. Now I wasn't able to get my hands on the exact grand jury testimony. I talked to District Attorney John Flynn, who just retired and went into public practice. And he told me, he says, John, I'm the district attorney, and I don't even know where I'd start looking for something that's 70 years old. It might not even exist. I tried, and I filed a Freedom of Information Law request that was never answered in this regard. But John Flynn did call me back, and he goes, I'm just being honest with you. I just don't know. I don't know where this stuff would be kept, which I thought was sort of unusual, but he was being honest with me. So, but that's a good question you asked, sir, but I really don't have an answer because I don't know. But there is no evidence that I was able to uncover anywhere by reading all these articles in all these papers. There was no evidence that Nelson Frank, who took these pictures, was called to testify before the grand jury. Wasn't even called. And he took these pictures. He took these pictures, he took them to the Buffalo Evening News, which then shared all these photographs with the Associated Press, and the Associated Press made these photographs available to news organizations, magazines, and newspapers all across the world. Some of Nelson's photographs were also in Life magazine, the April 19th edition of Life magazine. But now, no firemen here at all. Some firemen were here, and people are still wondering where the fire started. You know, I just read some of these headlines. Now, some of the consensus early on was the fire started in a room across from the music room. Now, the music room where all these children died was way on the other side of this building, way back in there where all that black smoke is. The room across was back here. You don't see any fire there. There's no fire there at all. This picture here was taken the next day across on the other side of that building. That's where all the bodies of these 10 children were found, all huddled under the windows. These kids had no chance at all. All these warning signs that either had been ignored or just misunderstood, or no one really complained to the school board, but sure enough were enough, and I wrote about that in my book also. The warning signs were there, but for some reason they got swept. I can't say they got swept under the rug, because that wouldn't be correct. Why they weren't pursued in an official investigation is a mystery. I mean, if anybody wanted to write another book about this fire, there's something else you could write about. There's a few other things too that I was unable to find out, even by filing Freedom of Information law requests. You know, one in particular had to do with the two men who were in charge of maintaining the furnace that caused this fire. There were two men who were employed by the Cleveland Hill School District. One guy's name was Francis Abbott, and the other man's name was Richard Schlack. Now, when the grand jury investigated and interrogated these two men, they said, no, the furnace appeared to be working perfectly the morning of the fire. Nothing wrong with it. You know, of course, they asked more questions. Other people were brought in. But when the grand jury finally reached a conclusion after a 15-day investigation, no indictments that were handed up. They called it no bill. It really means they're not going to indict anybody, even though the grand jury was instructed by the district attorney in April of 1954, if you can find credible evidence to link these two men to this fire, you may charge them with second-degree manslaughter, and they'll be prosecuted in the courts. Well, the grand jury had no indictments. You know why? Because these two men never signed an agreement that actually spelled out their responsibilities. In other words, the school district was concerned that they could be open to a lawsuit by these two guys if they got charged with second-degree manslaughter. So, it's, everybody was protecting everybody else. Everybody was protecting everybody else. Now, In defense of these two guys, if there is any, this man, Mr. Abbott, was called before the school board the day after the fire. And he told the school board under oath, he said, in 1952, I rebuilt this entire furnace in the summer of 1952, 2 years previous to the fire. He says, I rebuilt the entire furnace firebox myself. And as far as I'm concerned, it was operating perfectly. But then, he said, after the 1952 heating season, we noticed some hairline cracks. We immediately got some compound, some paste, and passed all this stuff up to prevent any problems. Now he's admitting to the school board that his repair job didn't last one heating season. Now, 3 days later, he grants an interview to the Buffalo Evening News because he and this other guy, it's guilt by association, and it's piling up on these guys like there's no tomorrow. So he just felt, I've got to do something, to protect my integrity and, my honesty and all that stuff. So, again, he goes to the Buffalo News and he goes, with my own hands, these hands that I'm showing you, he says, I rebuilt that furnace. And as far as we could see, there was no holes, there was nothing. I mean, he says, don't you think I'd know if I saw a hole in the furnace? Okay. And the News published his, hoping to maybe take a little heat off himself. He did not tell the Buffalo News in that interview what he told the school board, that the hairline cracks were discovered in the furnace after just one heating season in 1952. So, when the grand jury didn't indict, the Cheektowaga Times went crazy. I mean, they just lambasted the grand jury, for not holding these guys responsible, regardless of what they were going to do if they were found responsible. But the grand jury did find, even though these guys said, the furnace was operating properly the morning of the fire. We don't understand how this fire could have started. The warning signs, as confirmed by the grand jury, thermostats that were hooked up to the furnace weren't even working. In other words, if you turn the thermostat to lower the temperature or increase the temperature, weren't even working. There were some control arms attached to the furnace around the damper. They were broken. There were holes in a chimney flue. There was a squirrel cage fan that was meant to circulate air through the furnace in case it got too hot. The squirrel cage was not working either. All this stuff was piling up. And it all came to a head on March 31st, 1954. And in my book, I described it as these children were assaulted by a frightening confluence of everything that could possibly go wrong at the same time. The fire just flared up, and when it did, all they could think of, go to the windows. That's the only way to escape. Go to the windows. When they got to the windows, they found windows that were smaller than these windows on the cabinet. They were just little windows like this. And they were painted shut. You couldn't open the windows, and breaking them was almost impossible. And these kids are pounding on the glass. 3 adults in the room were desperately trying to push some of the kids through the windows. Some of the kids were being cut by shards of glass. And there's one true heroine in this entire story, and that was the music teacher in that room, Mrs. Melba Siebel. She was the last person to leave that burning building as the fire was raging out of control. She couldn't help anybody else. These children huddled beneath her were burned beyond recognition. In 10 minutes. It was horrible. When Melba finally escaped, she jumped through a window and her flesh was torn by these shards of glass that were sticking up from the windows. 5 more kids died in hospitals 4 or 5 days after the fire. And there were 16 others that were injured, many of them badly, badly burned. 2 of them were hospitalized for months on end. Now, the Cheektowaga Times, I told you, wasn't very happy when the grand jury did not indict these 2 guys. I mean, they just excoriated these guys in an editorial. But you know what they said? And here's where one of my Freedom of Information Law requests failed. They said, how can you let these guys go out scot-free? These guys were criminals. One of them was charged with second-degree assault or some other crime. It was a felony. And one was charged with armed robbery or grand larceny, one of those things. It's in my book. Now, how could, I mean, the newspaper never identified these guys, never identified them, but, I mean, everybody knew who the newspaper was talking about, everybody.
These charges were before?
The Cheektowaga Times, these guys sometime in their lives had been charged with these serious crimes, and now, so I gotta get to the bottom of this. I filed a Freedom of Information Law request with the Buffalo Police Department. I mean, I don't know how many of you are readers and how closely you pay attention to what's going on, but one of the things that especially small neighborhood newspapers now are contending with is when they file a Freedom of Information Law request, it goes and lays on some table somewhere, and government doesn't care. They'll take their sweet time answering. Okay? Now, I wrote this letter, and I said, please consider this a Freedom of Information Law request. That's how you do it. My wife and I went out to breakfast out to the town of Alden. And so after we got done with breakfast, I said, I gotta find a mailbox so I can mail this because I gotta get this information. So I'm out in Alden, and we stopped at a bank, and I went and I said, oh, Jesus. They're not gonna pick this up until Monday afternoon at 4 o'clock. Okay, but I mailed it anyway, right? Now, all of a sudden, it's Friday. Friday, 5 days later, I get a reply from the Buffalo Police Department, from the commissioner, a representative of a police commissioner of Vermont, telling me, we have exhaustively researched your plan. And we are unable to help you with this information. But don't forget, we want to remind you that you have a right to appeal our decision and blah, blah, blah. Okay. I mean, you know how long it must have taken my letter, first of all, to get to the city? Picked up and I have an answer already on Friday saying they exhaustively, looked for my information. So I figured I'm not going to bother filing an appeal because I know it wasn't going to get anywhere. I did the next best thing. I sent an appeal to Mayor Byron Brown, who I had a very good relationship with when I worked in media. Didn't do a thing. So there's one of my Freedom of Information requests. Because I either wanted to confirm what the Cheektowaga Times was saying about these two guys, or I wanted to see that they'd be exonerated. You know, because the newspaper really shouldn't do it. That was unnecessary. You're gonna ask a question?
Yeah, was there no Cheektowaga Police Department then? Wouldn't they have been the agency of record?
Well, no. The Cheektowaga Police Department had nothing to do with this editorial. They said they had been arrested in Buffalo.
Oh,
I'm sorry if I left that out.
you're talking about their
These two guys, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, they had been arrested in the city of Buffalo. One was charged with this crime, the other was charged with that crime. But I was never able to corroborate any of that information. So, you know, as things drag on, you know, there are happy endings, there are terrible endings. As we know, the cause of the fire was poor furnace maintenance. And then after that, the whole thing started up. All these annexes that were in the city, in the suburbs, all over western New York, across New York State, they were being torn down. They were shut. People did not want any school to be made out of wood. They were called fire traps. And they wanted nothing to do with wood. Never mind that they lived in a house made out of wood. They didn't want the kids to go into a school that was made out of that material. And some of the lumber companies even came up with some wacky and really perplexing explanations about, you know, wood is great, you know. I even made reference to a comment made by a lumber company representative who said, if the door in that room were made out of wood instead of metal, the fire wouldn't have spread that quickly. It was just, there was, you know, sometimes people make, you know, intelligent people say stupid things. And like I pointed out in my book, you would wonder how a modern day public relations company with people skilled in crisis management, you know, how they might have handled, you know, a public relations story like that. But
Wasn't there any inspection when they put that new furnace in?
well, that's another good question. One of the questions that I raised in my book, after this guy, Francis Abbott, said he spent, you know, an entire week during the summer of 1952 rebuilding the fire, I said, why did he do this? Was there a complaint? Was there an inspection of the furnace? I said, but most importantly, why would something that important not be delegated to a professional, competent, commercial heating contractor? You know, but he did this work all by himself.
I think today the state would send something.
Sure. And it failed with deadly consequences. Well, you're talking about the state. Here's another thing that I uncovered in my book, and there's just a short paragraph that explains it, but boy, does it hit home. Because all of these annexes being built by the federal government, were these buildings built to code? County code, New York State code, okay? Well, we took that question to a Board of Education official who said he didn't know. No. But you know, the good thing, you know, like I said, I wrote in my book, you know, how dare the sun shine again the next morning after this fire? I mean, how? And I quoted Maya Angelou, the civil rights activist and poet, and she drove home the fact that, you know, no matter how bad things are, tomorrow is going to be better. And you wonder how people could lose these children. How could any tomorrow possibly be better? But it did, there was one better. And that's because of all of the reforms in school building construction, school safety, fire escapes, timely drills, windows that could be opened, more than one door for ingress and egress. So there was one better thing that came, and it came in the form of all these reforms. Schools all over, Cheektowaga especially, were closed the following week. And they signed contracts with local contractors to have fire escapes installed, different windows that could be opened. They weren't going to be taking any chance. Now, I want to move ahead a little bit to tell you about some of the better things that happened. There were some very interesting stories. You know, the book is all about tragedy, and you know, my wife was crying when she was reading one of my manuscripts, and she said, "Is there anything good in this book that's so I can stop crying?" So, well, there were a number of kids who were injured that went on to very special careers in medicine. Now, there was one boy who was badly burned in that fire. His name was Jackson Frank. And when he was so badly burned in the fire that he never would show his hands to people. But someone brought him a guitar when he was hospitalized to help him. It was a distraction from his mental illness and reminding him of the fire. And he became very good. Became very, very good. Now, when Jackson Frank turned 21, he received the fruits of the lawsuit that his mom and dad had filed against the Cleveland Hill School District. Okay. It amounted to about $700,000 in today's dollars. And with that, he told his mom and dad, "I am going to England, and I'm going to pursue my career as an American folk artist." And he got on a boat, and he went to England. And while he was on that boat, he wrote what has turned out to be his most memorable American folk song. It's a song called "Blues Run the Game." He also wrote a very touching tribute to one of the girls who died in the fire. He apparently loved her very much. Her name was Marlene DuPont. Very, very pretty girl. She perished in the fire. Well, he wrote this just wonderful folk song dedicated to her, and it was included in an album that was back in 1967. The album came out. The album was produced by Simon and Garfunkel. When Jackson Frank went to England, he hooked up with Simon and Art Garfunkel as their career and their iconic presence in worldwide popular music was fomenting and growing. They became megastars, and he worked with them. There's a picture in my book with Jackson Frank and Elvis Presley. Back when the young man graduated from Cleveland Hill, he moved to the town of Elma, and he graduated from Iroquois Central High School. And after graduation, his mom took him on a sightseeing trip. They went to see some of the Civil War here at Gettysburg, and they went to Graceland Mansion. And when one of Elvis Presley's employees heard Jackson Frank's story, he goes, "Wait a minute, come into the main house." And he brought Elvis, who was in his swimming trunks. And I have the picture that was taken that day of Jackson Frank and Elvis Presley. However, as talented as Jackson Frank was, his life just collapsed and unraveled with drugs and booze. And he died as a young man. He was only 56 years old. But he was inducted into the Buffalo Music Hall of Fame in 2015, I think it was. And that's Jackson Frank's story. Now, talk about people. One of the things that a lot of people and I addressed this in a chapter in my book. Nobody wanted to talk about the fire. No one. They didn't even build memorials to these poor children for decades after the fire. For some reason, they just didn't want to address it. They didn't want to talk about it. And my book examines why. And it's pretty plain. But Jackson Frank's mom and dad lived in the town of Elma. That's where I lived. Well, Marilyn Frank was a local government watchdog. She kept all the local politicians in the town of Elma honest. She once even endorsed me for a political office. I had many conversations with her on her porch. We talked about all sorts of things, including family, blah, blah, blah. Marilyn Frank never mentioned to me that she was Jackson Frank's mother. Never mentioned it. The guy who took this picture, these iconic pictures, he was no stranger to me. We were both members of the Buffalo Industrial Photographers Association. You know, I love photography. I've been involved with it all my life. My specialty is three-dimensional photography, like Viewmaster. Now, we would have a function at Chef's Restaurant twice a year. One year, it's my job to find the guest speaker, okay? Now, I had already gotten a guest speaker at a previous luncheon, a friend, Bob Smith. Remember Bob Smith, the photographer for the Buffalo Bills, who took all the iconic photographs of O.J. Simpson, breaking the 2,000-yard thing. I had him as a guest speaker at one function, and I couldn't find anybody for my next one. You know, so I mentioned this to another member of the club. He goes, "Why don't you go talk to Nelson Frank?" And I says, what would he talk about? He goes, "Nelson is the guy who took the first pictures of the Cleveland Hill fire." I mean, I didn't know what to say. Nelson didn't want to do it. Didn't want to do it. He says, I don't think I could get through it. So, funny things. There's another young lady I wrote about. Her name is Maribel Bressler. She had been in that music room earlier in the day for her violin lesson. Absent-mindedly left her musical instrument in the room and needed to go back there to get it. So she went to her teacher, and to be in the hallway, you needed a permission slip. That's the way it was. You know, you're in school, you need a permission slip to be in the hallway without supervision. So Mrs. Graham signs this note, and Maribel has had this note all her life, and I reproduced it in my book. You know, Maribel has permission to go to the music room. She was almost there, when the place just blew up. And she was forced back down the hallway. She could have actually, if it was 10 seconds more, she might have been in that room with all those other kids. And the other girl I wrote about, her name was Patty Neal. Boy, she badly burned, but managed to survive. Like everybody else, her parents filed a lawsuit. She had already made plans of what to do with her money once she became of age, 21. She wanted to buy a brand new car, and she wanted to go to Hawaii. That's what Patty Neal wanted. Now, you know, the impetuous spirit of youth, when it starts tugging away, you do crazy things, especially if you have money. She got a brand new car. She booked a trip to Hawaii and came back a quadriplegic. in an accident diving in shallow water in Hawaii. She lived for another 21 years after that. Just one sad story on top of another. But then, there's one guy, again, another guy that I was well acquainted with in my days in media. And he was the homeroom teacher of all those 6th graders who died in the fire. He called in sick the day of the fire. And when he found out about the fire, he was just devastated. His name was Thomas Griffin. Thomas Griffin, who became Buffalo Parks Commissioner for his brother Jimmy Griffin, the mayor. But after a while, even he, became a little unstable and unpredictable, in his later years. But anyway, all that stuff's in the book, and a lot of other interesting things. And I'll tell you why I brought this 6-pack of beer. This has to do with my previous book, The Day the Buffalo River Burned. It's about water pollution.
Oh, yeah.
I don't know if you realize this, but the next civil war in this country could very well be fought over clean water.
Yes, Lord.
I was driving my stepson to the airport several months ago, and he started talking to me about the water and how he enjoyed this book, and he was getting set to go back home to Phoenix. Well, to make a long story short, he said, when push comes to shove, we're going to have a pipeline from the Great Lakes all the way down, down to Colorado and California. It ain't going to happen. It ain't going to happen. The International Joint Commission, which has every state that borders the Great Lakes, is represented. Both the U.S. and Canada are members of the International Joint Commission. Believe me, there's not going to be any pipeline. I mean, I'm serious. The next civil war could be fought over clean water. It's called the lubricant of life. So anyway, why I brought the beer is, and I had mentioned to you before that I had sent Mayor Byron Brown an appeal for my Freedom of Information Law request denial. And nothing was ever acknowledged. He must have a bunch of people around him to just shield him from everything. Now, I had contacted him in regards to this book, but I had sent him a copy of my book after it was printed. I sent him manuscripts as I was writing the book to see if there was anything, because I wanted him to show the manuscript to other people to find, you want to double check, triple check, and quadruple check all your facts. You don't want someone coming up to you after you wrote a book saying, hey, this is wrong, that's wrong. Well, nothing from Byron Brown. I practically pleaded with him. You would think that the mayor of Buffalo would be interested in something that was going on in his city. He's the Brooklyn guy. So, he's always been very accommodating, but I'm sure that it's the people who are around him. And that's one of the reasons, all of my requests to him, Richard. And the reason I brought this 6-pack in here, because I wanted the mayor to get involved. I wanted the mayor to get involved in something very positive. And that would be what the city of Cleveland, Ohio did.
Yes.
When they cleaned up the Cuyahoga River. They turned it into an annual celebration. We could do the same thing here.
Sure.
And I wanted a local beer company to come up with a burning Buffalo River beer, to honor this man, who spent 40 years of his life, trying to impress on people the importance of clean water. Anyway, anybody have any questions?
Wow.
I'm hungry, but I'll chop them down too. I attended Maryville schools and had very vague recollections of this fire. My mother was having a house party on that day. We lived in Cheektowaga, the Maryville district, which, as you know, is adjacent. And I, as a really little kid, but I had this vision of how the news of that fire swept, because they were all people from Cleveland Hill or from Cheektowaga. I don't know how that news spread, and my question to you was there any, in those days, electronic coverage of any of this? Was there radio, or I doubt any television, but are you aware of anything?
There were only two television stations on, Channel 4,
Right,
which was owned by the Buffalo Evening News,
right.
and Channel 2. Channel 7 didn't go on the air until 1958.
Yeah.
I would imagine, and this is something that I really should have thought about, but actually I did, but I just didn't pursue it because the Buffalo Hall of Fame, the Broadcasting Association, now is in the process of taking all this newsreel film that has been donated to them by these TV stations, because the TV stations have no room for all this stuff, especially film, you know.
And it's the same.
And they're trying to digitize all this stuff so that later on, they can generate some income for the association in case anyone wants to, to do some research, whether it's a house fire or a tragic railroad accident or something political or.
I haven't even been able to determine if there was a daily newscast back in.
Oh, sure there was. Oh, sure there was. WBEN back in 1954. As it was, through the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, and 90s, had a huge newsroom.
Yes.
When it was owned by the Buffalo Evening News,
Yes.
because the publisher of the news, Al Kirchhofer, would send people with scripts, and they would hand them direct to Jack Ogilvy at WBEN, and then when their noon newscast came out, they had everything that was happening.
So you suspect there was some type of
Oh, yeah.
coverage on radio?
Sure.
Okay.
But then here's another thing too. Talk about people not opening up and being quiet about something so tragic and so important. I wrote in my book a story about a page about the first reporter to arrive on the scene of the fire. His name was Fran Luca. Okay?
New frame.
Okay. Now, the name is familiar to you, I know, but it might not be familiar to everybody else. But now, Fran Luca, I talked to him on the phone the other day, just turned 99. He was the first radio reporter for radio station WBNY. This,
Must have been like the Hindenburg.
yeah, this little guy over here is Fran Luca.
He was on scene then.
Yeah, he was right there. He was the first radio reporter. Now, he just told me over lunch that, they never told him that people had jumped out the windows on the other side of the building because they didn't want the media to know.
Right.
Because parents started to show up, wondering why their children didn't come home on school buses. And then after the smoke cleared, they went around to the other side of the building and saw firemen, wrapping these charred bodies in white blankets and passing them from one firefighter to another. That's how they found his 10 children. Yes, sir.
If Mr. Luca was there in that photo, where was he when he heard that the fire broke out? How long did it take him to get there? And then he's there, but the fire department is not there.
Good
How
question.
long did it take from
Yes.
11:22
It had to
when the
be-
fire department got there?
It had to be, from what I have been able to determine, is that a lot of the reporters responding to this fire thought that they might be going to cover a fire in a vacant building that was, quote, dangerously close to an occupied school. Now, how long did it take Fran to get there from Maine and, I forgot the street where WBNY was located. But it was in downtown Buffalo. Had to take 20 minutes. You know.
So how close was a fire department to the school? And if it took him 20 minutes to get there, we're talking a minimum of 20 minutes with no response time.
Yeah.
Less than a mile away.
Oh, yeah. Oh, it's a matter of city blocks.
Yeah.
The firemen from the Cleveland Hill Fire Department, they were conducting a drill that morning. They were almost in the neighborhood, yet it's still, now, just because, here's what you have to understand. Just because, and I documented this at the end of my book, just because the fire started at 11:22 a.m., and just because firemen had been conducting a drill, exactly where they were conducting the drill, I'm not positive, okay? But it supposedly would lessen the time for them to get to the fire hall because they were already in a drill. They went right to the fire when they heard about it. But here's the problem. Although the fire started at 11:22 in the morning, the alarm was not sounded by the police department in Cheektowaga until 11:35.
What?
And it's eternity when lives are at stake.
No one from the school, there was no alarm in the school.
There was no alarm in the school. They didn't have smoke detectors in schools back then. They didn't have alarms. Everything went through. If there's any volunteer firemen here, they'll probably tell you, things were very different back in 1954. In other words, I also wrote in my book about what would happen if someone reported a fire from an alarm box. There were 11 alarm boxes in the Cleveland Hill Fire District. But when a fire is reported by someone turning an alarm at a box on a street corner, they have to stay there. Because if they leave, when the firemen get to where the alarm was sounded, and no one's there to tell them where the emergency is, they've lost valuable time. All that has now changed with fire radios in houses and...
Another question, and you referenced the fact that the furnace spinning wheel wasn't working, the fan wasn't working. You referenced the fact that the thermometers were not coupled to the furnace. Was that information available prior to the fire, or did this information come out after the fire?
They had to be aware. They had to be aware because I wrote in my book in several places that there had been reports turned in by teachers of smoke-filled hallways, haze in the hallways, the smell of coal dust. There were workers who testified before the grand jury that they were working installing a fire door, and all of a sudden, all of the children were being taken out of the annex and taken out of school. They were coughing. It turns out that coal was being dumped into the basement, into the coal bin.
Yeah.
And they didn't have any way to stop the coal dust from just permeating the air inside the annex. But you know, in closing, let me just tell you this, and you've asked some very good questions. If this fire has started 3 months prior, the death toll could have been in the hundreds. Because there could have been nearly 250 children in that building. But in December of 1953, everybody was moved into the main building, and the annex was only used for art class and music class, very sparingly. Otherwise, it could have been much, much worse.
I have one thing to say. I grew up in Warsaw, they had those kind of
You
buildings.
say Warsaw?
Warsaw,
You grew up in Warsaw, okay.
or grade school. The thing is, I told her, I said, to the teacher, why are we, classes began in Zeech's furnitures, because they had no place to put us. And I asked the teacher later, she told me all about the storm, and she had been one of those nurses, one of the schools. One of the school teachers on Sunday, and she just melted. I just remember that was, because I'm born in 50, I was 4 years old. When I went to kindergarten, that's fresh. And I was asking, why are we in the building? Why are we in with the furniture? Because they had to, because there's so many, but they started, later I found out what they had kicked down the bad buildings.
Yeah, right.
And I remember her just breaking. So I'm touching someone that was right there.
Yeah, very tragic.
Well,
Excuse me.
Oh, okay.
I just have a quick question. Was Nelson Frank related at all to Jackson Frank in any way?
No relation.
Okay.
Yeah.
Are any members of the Frank family still in Western New York?
Huh?
Are any members of Jackson Frank's family still in Western New York?
Yes, a daughter, and I met her at Cleveland Hill High School in March 27th. They had a massive remembrance assembly, and she came, and I got a chance to meet her, and I gave her a copy of the book, and she had no idea I was writing the book, and she had no idea her dad took these pictures.
no,
No idea her dad took these pictures, yeah.
I just, to finish my story, is found out later the teacher wanted to commit suicide. But the memories, again, what she was, she killed herself.
Oh, that's terrible.
Because they transferred her there, people come to research.
Okay, thank you for coming.
I don't know if any other people who are there in your audience tonight.
You were
there?
You were at the school? Now, how old are you now? Okay.
Wow. This gentleman was in school.
Now, you obviously, you were there, you were in the main building.
I was in the main building, but I was in that group that was referred to in the newspaper article a week ago.
Yeah, there was an art class and a music class.
Right.
That was in the room
But
before.
I was in the same room in that class before.
Oh, with Barbara Breeding?
Yes. In fact, she lived 3 doors down from me as a neighbor. So we
Well,
grew up together.
you should have said something, you sat here so quietly.
Wow. Did you know Jackson Frank?
Name sounds familiar, but I'm trying to put me.
Okay.
These were all paid fire departments?
No.
These weren't volunteer fire departments?
Oh, yes. Strictly volunteer fire.
Strictly volunteers?
Oh, yeah.
Could that have some delay maybe because of that?
Oh, yeah, but don't forget,
Yeah.
that's just the way it was back then. The alarm was sounded by the police department, and the siren would go off. That would take time. When these guys heard the sirens, hopefully they were home. If they were at work, they didn't show up. Then they have to get to the fire hall. Then they have to get dressed. And then they have to wait until a certain amount of men show up. Then they get in the truck and head to the scene. It's tragic, but that's the way it worked.
Today they're paid, right?
Pardon?
Cheektowaga, they're paid too?
No, it's a strictly volunteer fire.
Really?
Yes.
Cleveland Hill Fire Department is.
Yeah, Cleveland Hill Fire Department is a 100% volunteer agency, yes.
Question I had is, all of your contacts with people, interviews and so on, did you ever talk to any of the people who started the fire itself, the classmates of mine, but the one that came in as we were leaving. As we were walking from the music classroom back into the main building, the two classes passed each other in the hallway and so on. But around the corner of the bend going back toward the hallway of the building, I noticed a couple of men, you know, a little way in the distance, and behind them what seemed to be a fairly intensive fire. Now, I don't know if it was the coal-fired boiler that I was actually seeing them dealing with, but I think I was asked the question, was there anything you could have done?
To prevent the fire, you mean? No, I don't think anything could have been done. I think it was poorly maintained for so long.
But the reason I say that is that it's hard for me to escape the fact that
I know what you're saying too. Then too.
what you have said previously reinforces it, and that is that when you talk about causation, we, as a trained historian myself, taught for years at SUNY Brockport, usually attention is paid, as you have, to the human element. Admittedly, the structure was decrepit. People shouldn't have been in that building anyway.
That's right.
But they were, mostly for ill. But in any case, those gentlemen that I saw, I thought in my own mind at the time, just talking and passing time of day on our job, taking care of the furnace or whatever.
But you don't know.
I thought.
But you don't know who these two people were, do you?
Well, I recognized the one gentleman as Mr. Abbott.
Oh, really?
I think he was the chief custodian, if I'm not
Yes,
mistaken,
right.
for the district.
Right.
And I thought, well, what if I'd gone to, say, the principal's office on my way back to Mrs. Graham's classroom, where Barbara Breeding was, a classmate of mine, and if I had said something to him, something seemed strange, going on there in the annex I was just in. Because there was a sort of, to me at least, there was sort of a combination of smell and sense of overheating.
Mm-hmm.
And, what if I'd gone to him or said something to my school teacher when I got back in the classroom? Wonder what's going on down there. And,
How old were you then?
12. But
Don't feel bad.
no, I'm also become convinced, and partly from what you said today, that in all likelihood, Mr. Restorff, who was the principal, very
Conscientious.
tremendous guy, and every sense of the word, or Mrs. Graham, the classroom teacher that I went back to, I suspect that their response would have been somewhat like any of us might be tonight. Well, they were just there doing their job and, talking and so on. But I've often wondered if these are, as custodians of the physical property, mainly in terms of their job description, but also being like teachers, bus drivers, part of that expression we use in loco parentis, in the position or place of the parent. As school children, all these people collectively take the place of the parent in the educational process. And it often wondered about if either or both of those gentlemen, for whatever understandable reasons, gone to the bathroom,
Well, these two
took a
gentlemen,
lunch break.
these two gentlemen, when they heard about the fire, they claim that they made an effort to enter the classroom, but were driven back by smoke and flames, and they just went back into the high school building. And that's,
I'm wondering where they were at the time.
I don't know, I don't know.
That's the question
Yeah.
that was raised in my mind. Were they were there,
Oh, they were
I would
there,
say 20
yeah.
20 minutes, let's say, to a half hour in that time range. When I saw them there, and, you know, I got up in the classroom and almost simultaneously, as the fire alarm went off in the building, Mrs. Graham was sitting in the back in the corner of the room, overlooking the annex. And I said, oh my God, you know, school's on fire. Simultaneously, you know, the alarm went off. We went next door to the high school auditorium.
Yeah, I can imagine what went through your mind all these years. Yeah, it's tough to hold, to have all that back, you're wondering, you know. Anyway, if anybody's interested in the book, it's $16, and I'll stop boring you. Unless you want to, you want to,
Bottle of beer.
Well, I want to thank you all again for coming, and thank you, John, for that wonderful presentation. Just a quick PSA of some upcoming events. This Friday night, we have a concert by Bart Dentino. He'll be doing an acoustic show, so please come and check that out. It's his first one in many years, so we're breaking the ice again. It'll be at 7 o'clock this Friday, right here. In this very room. So, and then our next guest speaker will be 2 weeks from tonight. This will be May 15th, but at 6 p.m. not 7, so a little earlier. We're having Derek Pratt of the Erie Canal Museum in Syracuse coming out, and he's going to talk about baseball as it grew along the Erie Canal. So be sure to come and check that out, but it is at 6, not the normal time of 7. So besides that, just keep an eye on the website, Facebook, our email blasts. If you're not a member, consider becoming a member, as you'll get notified of everything that's going on. And May 16th, Tyler would kill me if I didn't say it, but May 16th is our new exhibit opening. Our wedding dress exhibit that Tyler has tirelessly been working on. Almost all the wrinkles are out. So that'll be at 6 o'clock. We'll be having a nice event with catering from Terry Hills, who's one of the sponsors. So be sure we'll hope to see you that night as well.
Thank you very much.